The wind howled over the jagged spine of the saw-tooth ridge, a sound like 1,000 mournful ghosts crying out for entrance into the world of the living. Here, at 9,000 feet, the air was thin and sharp enough to bleed the lungs of a lowland man. Even in late May, the shadows of the towering lodgepole pines held onto crusted patches of snow, refusing to yield to a sun that seemed distant and weak. Silas Blackwood stood knee-deep in the icy rush of Painted Creek, his hands numb as he worked the mechanism of a beaver trap. The water was brutal. Liquid ice fed by the glacial melt from the peaks that loomed overhead, indifferent gods of granite and slate. Silas did not feel the cold, or rather, he chose not to acknowledge it. He was a man carved from the same hard substance as the mountain itself. He was 40 years old, though the weather and the war had etched lines into his face that made him look 50. A jagged scar ran from his left temple down into his beard, a souvenir from a Confederate saber at a place called Antietam, a name that tasted like ash and blood whenever he allowed himself to think it. He hauled the trap and its prize onto the bank, the muscles of his shoulders burning with a familiar, dull ache. He was a big man, broad through the chest and heavy with the kind of functional strength that came from dragging timber and wrestling elk carcasses. He moved with a silence that belied his size, a habit learned from years of hunting and years of being hunted. The cabin sat half-hidden on a rocky shelf a mile up the slope, a squat structure of peeled logs chinked with mud and moss. It was not a home, it was a fortress against the elements. The roof was low to shed the wind. The windows were narrow slits covered with oiled paper and heavy shutters, and the chimney was a blackened pile of river stones that smoked perpetually. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke, cured furs, and solitary living. Silas trudged up the path, his breath pluming in the frigid dawn air. He spent his days in a rhythm that allowed no time for pity. He chopped wood until his palms blistered and calloused over, the axe swinging with a metronomic violence. He skinned his catch with surgical precision, the knife flashing in the dim light. He ate in silence at a rough-hewn table, chewing on tough venison jerky or cornmeal mush, staring at the fire as if daring it to go out. Nights were the hardest, when the wind battered the shutters, rattling the iron latch. The silence of the cabin grew heavy. That was when the memories came, unbidden and unwelcome. He would close his eyes and see the smoke drifting over the cornfields of Maryland, hear the scream of a terrified horse, or feel the weight of his younger brother, Thomas, dead in his arms, his uniform stained dark. He remembered Mary, too. He remembered her standing on the porch of her father's house in Ohio, twisting her handkerchief, telling him she could not marry a man who intended to drag her into the savage wilderness. She had wanted a parlor and a paved street. Silas had wanted nowhere to be found. Love is a weakness, he told himself as he stoked the dying fire. It was a luxury for soft men in soft cities. Out here, affection got you killed. Distraction meant a slip of the axe or a missed step on a shale slide. He did not need love. He needed to survive, but the winters were getting harder. The ache in his joints on rainy days was a warning. He could not haul water, chop wood, hunt, and cook alone forever. If he broke a leg, he would freeze or starve before the spring thaw. It was a cold, mathematical calculation. He needed a partner, not a wife in the poetic sense, but another pair of hands, a body to keep the fire fed while he checked the lines. He crossed the room to the small wooden chest at the foot of his narrow rope bed. Inside, beneath a layer of wool socks, lay a bundle of letters. They were creased and worn from the touch of his rough fingers. He sat by the firelight, unfolding them one by one. The agency in St. Louis had sent many. Most were flowery, written by women claiming to be pious widows or young ladies seeking adventure. They spoke of romance and Christian duty. Silas discarded those. He knew what the mountains did to romance. It froze it until it snapped. He stopped at the last letter. The handwriting was jagged, pressing hard into the cheap paper. My name is Ilara Vance. It read, I am 28 years old. I can cook. I can sew. And I am not afraid of hard work. I have no family and no prospects here. I have no illusions left about the world or the men in it. I do not ask for love, only a roof that does not leak and a name that is respectable. If you treat me with decency, I will do my duty by you." There was no talk of God's will or fluttering hearts. It was a contract. She sounded like a woman who had seen the bottom of the well and just wanted to climb out. Silas had gone to the stash of coins buried under the floorboards, money earned from 20 years of furs. He counted out the fare for the stagecoach and a little extra for a wedding ring. He wrote back a single page. "Come to Pine Hollow. I will be there on the 1st of June. I have a claim and a cabin. It is hard living. I offer protection and food. S. Blackwood." It was a business arrangement. He steeled himself to feel nothing more than the satisfaction of a trap well set. He needed a helpmate. She needed a shield. It was enough. 2,000 miles to the east. Elara Vance sat on a wooden bench in a train station in Chicago, clutching Silas's letter so tightly her knuckles were white. The air in the station was thick with coal smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, but she hardly noticed. She was staring at her reflection in the darkened glass of a ticket booth window. The face looking back was pale, framed by dark hair pulled back severely to hide its curl. Her eyes were wide and shadowed with exhaustion. She looked like a ghost, she thought, a ghost running from a graveyard of her own making. She boarded the train, and later the stagecoach, moving like a sleepwalker. Her small carpet bag contained everything she owned: 2 plain dresses, a Bible she couldn't bear to read, a sewing kit, and the crushing weight of her memories. She tried not to think of the house on Beacon Street. She tried to block out the image of Mr. Sterling, his heavy hands, the smell of his bay rum and cigar smoke as he cornered her in the pantry. She had been a seamstress, proud of her work, proud of her independence. He had been wealthy, powerful, and used to taking what he wanted. When she had fought him, clawing at his face, screaming until the housekeeper came running, he hadn't panicked. He had smiled. He told the police she had tried to rob him, that she was a woman of loose morals who had solicited him and turned violent when he refused. In the city, a rich man's lie was worth more than a poor woman's truth. The dismissal had been immediate. The whispers followed her to the boarding house. Whore, thief, fallen. Respectable families crossed the street to avoid her. Mothers pulled their children close. She had lost her room, her reputation, and finally, her hope. The West was not a destination, it was a last resort. It was the only place left where a name might still be just a name, not a brand. The journey was a nightmare that stretched over weeks. The landscape shifted from the green, rolling hills of the Midwest to the endless, flat expanse of the Great Plains. The world turned brown and gray, whipped by a relentless wind that drove dust into every seam of her clothing. Inside the stagecoach, the air was hot and stagnant, smelling of sweat and stale tobacco. Elara sat squeezed between a rotund salesman selling patent medicine and a severe-looking older woman traveling with her teenage daughter. The older woman, Mrs. Gable, had sniffed disdainfully when Elara explained she was traveling to marry a man she had never met. "A mail-order bride?" "Mrs." Gable had whispered to her daughter, loud enough for the whole coach to hear. "Don't stare. Sarah, it is not polite to look at women who sell themselves." Elara had turned her face to the window, watching the sagebrush blur by. Her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. Let them talk, she thought. Words are wind. Hunger is real. Cold is real. Words cannot hurt me anymore, but they did hurt. They stung like lye on raw skin. 3 days from Pine Hollow, the weather turned. The sky bruised purple, and rain lashed the plains, turning the road into a quagmire of sucking mud. The stagecoach lurched violently as the driver whipped the team, trying to outrun the rising creek ahead. They hit the water fast, too fast. The lead wheel struck a submerged log, and with a sickening crack of wood, the coach tipped. Elara was thrown against the ceiling, her shoulders slamming into the wood. Screams filled the small space. Cold water rushed in. They scrambled out into the mud, coughing and shivering. The coach was on its side, the axle shattered. One of the horses was thrashing in the water, a leg broken, screaming in panic until the driver ended its misery with a single, deafening gunshot. the driver's partner. A young man named Holloway lay in the mud, clutching his leg. A splinter of wood from the box had pierced his thigh, and the blood was bright red and pulsing. "Mrs." Gable was screaming, clutching her daughter. The salesman was useless, wringing his hands and moaning about his lost merchandise. Elara moved before she thought. She waded through the mud to Holloway. "Hold him down," she ordered the salesman, her voice cracking but loud. She tore the hem of her petticoat, the fabric ripping with a sharp sound. Her hands, usually so careful with a needle, were covered in mud and blood, but they did not shake. She made a tourniquet, twisting the fabric tight above the wound until the spurting slowed to an ooze. She packed the wound with clean linen from her bag and bound it. She sat with him through the night as the rain turned to snow, wiping the sweat from his brow as he burned with fever. She did not sleep. She watched the dark horizon, listening to the coyotes yipping in the distance. "You have steady hands, miss," Holloway whispered at dawn, his face gray. "I've had to mend harder things than skin," she said quietly. When the relief wagon arrived the next day, Mrs. Gable looked at Elara differently, not with kindness, but with a wary confusion, as if she couldn't reconcile the fallen woman with the one who had saved a life. Elara didn't care. She just wanted the motion to stop. Silas rode down from the high country 3 days before the stage was due. He brought 2 pack mules and his saddle horse, a massive roan gelding named Iron. He stopped at the edge of Pine Hollow, looking down at the collection of clapboard buildings and muddy streets. He hated this place. It smelled of coal smoke, manure, and greed. He rode down the main street, the hooves of his horses loud in the morning quiet. He wore his best buckskins, though they were stained with grease and pine pitch. A heavy buffalo coat hung from his shoulders, and a Colt Navy revolver sat at his hip. He looked like a piece of the wilderness that had broken off and rolled into town. Townspeople stopped to watch him pass. A group of miners lounging on the porch of the saloon went quiet, then snickered. "There's the hermit," one whispered. "Heard he bought himself a wife." "Poor girl," another muttered. "She'll be wolf bait by Christmas, or she'll take one look at that face of his and run back to Omaha." Silas stared straight ahead. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He knew what they saw. A scar-faced savage, half wild, unfit for civilized company. Let them look. He had gold in his pockets and a rifle in his scabbard. He needed nothing from them but supplies. He waited by the depot for 2 days. When the stage finally rumbled into town, delayed and battered, caked in mud, Silas felt a strange tightness in his chest. It wasn't excitement. It was the feeling of a man standing under a loose rock ledge, waiting for it to fall. The driver climbed down, limping, and opened the door. Elara stepped out. She was smaller than he expected. That was his first thought. She looked thin, her dress gray with dust, her bonnet battered. She held a carpetbag with both hands, pulling it close to her chest like a shield. She looked up, scanning the street, and her eyes landed on him. For a long moment, the noise of the town faded. Silas saw a woman who looked like she had walked through fire and was surprised to still be standing. He saw fear in her eyes, the skittish, wide-eyed look of a trapped doe. But beneath it, he saw a jaw set in a line of fierce stubbornness. Elara saw a mountain of a man. He was towering, bearded, his hair long and tied back with a leather thong. The scar on his face was jagged and white against his weathered skin. He looked dangerous. He looked like the kind of man who could snap a person in half and feel no remorse. But in his eyes, dark and deep-set, she didn't see the predatory gleam she was used to in the city. She saw a tightly controlled loneliness that mirrored her own. He stepped forward, his boots thudding on the boardwalk. He didn't smile. "You Elara?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, rusty from disuse. "I am," she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Are you Mr. Blackwood?" "Silas," he corrected. He stood there for a moment, unsure of the protocol. Then, awkwardly, He wiped his hand on his trousers and extended it. Ilara looked at the hand. It was huge, scarred, and calloused. A working hand. A killing hand? She hesitated only for a heartbeat. She was his wife now, or soon would be. She was his property in the eyes of the world. She shifted her bag and placed her hand in his. Her palm was ice cold. His was rough and dry. "Wagons this way," he said, dropping her hand quickly as if it burned him. "We need supplies before we head up. Storm's coming." "Yes," she said. "All right." He led her to the general store, the boardwalk creaking under his weight. Ilara walked a step behind him, keeping her head high, feeling the eyes of the town on her back. She heard the whispers. Look at her. Look at the dress. Too fine for a worker. Too poor for a lady. Who is she? Inside the store, the air smelled of coffee beans and dry goods. The storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson with watery eyes, looked up and smirked when he saw the pair. "Well now, Silas," Henderson said, his voice oily. "See you got your package. Mail service is getting slow, ain't it?" Silas ignored him, placing a list on the counter. 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of beans, 10 pounds of coffee, sugar, salt pork, and a box of 44 cartridges. Henderson chuckled, leaning over the counter to look at Ilara. His eyes raked over her, stripping away the dust and the coat. It was the same look Mr. Sterling had given her. The look that said, "I know what you are." "Bit scrawny for a mountain wife, ain't she?" Henderson said, loud enough for the two women browsing the fabric aisle to giggle. "Hope she came with a return policy. Silas, these mail-order wives, usually damaged goods, if you catch my drift." Ilara flinched. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her shoulders hunched, and she stared at the floor, waiting for the laughter, waiting for Silas to join in, to nod and agree that she was just a piece of livestock he had purchased. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas turned slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't draw his gun. He simply leaned forward, placing his heavy hands flat on the counter. He loomed over the storekeeper, his scarred face a mask of cold fury. "Pack the flour, Henderson," Silas said. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but it carried a vibration of violence that stopped the breath in Ilara's throat. "And while you do it, you keep a civil tongue in your head. You speak of this lady with respect, or I will pull this counter down on top of you and close your shop for good." Henderson turned pale. He swallowed hard, his smirk vanishing. I was just joking. Silas, no offense meant." "Pack," Silas commanded. He turned his back on the man and looked at Ilara. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock. No one had ever defended her. No one. Men had used her, hidden her, or blamed her. But this stranger, this mountain savage, had stood between her and the world's scorn without blinking. "You all right?" he asked, his voice returning to its gruff baseline. Yes," she whispered. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he muttered, adjusting his coat. "I don't pay for goods and get insulted in the bargain." They loaded the mules in silence. As they rode out of town, Ilara on the roan horse and Silas walking ahead leading the pack string, the town watched them go, but this time, no one spoke a word. The climb began almost immediately. The road narrowed to a trail that wound up the side of the canyon, following the roar of the river. The air grew cooler with every mile. The trees changed from cottonwoods to towering spruce and pine. Ilara gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles white. She had never been on a horse before. The ground dropped away sharply to her right, a sheer cliff falling hundreds of feet to the churning white water below. The scale of the place was terrifying. The mountains were like jagged teeth biting into the sky. She felt small, insignificant. "Don't look down," Silas called back, not turning around. "Look at the horse's ears. He knows where his feet are." They rode for hours. The civilization she had known, the cobblestones, the brick buildings, the gas lamps, seemed to dissolve, replaced by rock and ice and sky. The sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted. Ilara shivered, her thin coat offering little protection against the mountain chill. "We camp here," Silas announced, stopping in a small clearing beneath a grove of ancient pines. "Too dark to make the ridge tonight." He moved with efficient speed, hobbling the horses, unloading the packs, and striking a fire from flint and steel. Elara tried to help, gathering twigs, but her hands were so numb she kept dropping them. Silas noticed. He stopped what he was doing and walked over to her. "Sit," he said, pointing to a log near the fire. "Thaw out." He took a heavy wool blanket from his bedroll, the only one he had brought for himself, and held it out to her. "Wrap up," he ordered. "But what about you?" she asked, her teeth chattering. "It's freezing." "I've slept in snowdrifts before," he said shortly. "Take it." She took the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled of him, wood smoke, horse, and pine resin. It was heavy and warm. They ate a supper of hardtack and dried beef in silence. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkness. Beyond the ring of light, the forest breathed. Twigs snapped. The wind sighed in the branches. Elara sat stiffly, watching him. He sat across the fire, cleaning his rifle. The flames danced in his eyes, making his scar look deeper, more twisted. They were miles from anyone. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she didn't know, a man who had bought her ticket and expected a wife. Panic began to rise in her throat, a familiar, choking bile. She remembered the nights in the boarding house, pushing a chair under the doorknob. She remembered Mr. Sterling's weight. She pulled her knees to her chest, making herself small. Silas looked up from the rifle. He saw the way she curled in on herself, the way her eyes darted to his hands. He felt a pang of something strange in his gut, not anger, but a heavy, dull sadness. She was terrified of him. He set the rifle down carefully, leaning it against a log away from him. "You sleep," he said, his voice rough. "I'll keep the fire up." You aren't coming to sleep?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Silas looked at her directly. "I told you. Elara, I needed a partner. I didn't send for a woman to use her. You take the blanket, you sleep, I'll stay here." He turned his gaze back to the fire, his posture rigid. He crossed his arms over his chest, settling in for a long, cold vigil. Elara watched him for a long time. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he deliberately kept his eyes averted to give her privacy. He was a wall of muscle and scar tissue, yet he was shivering slightly in his buckskins, having given her his warmth. Slowly, the panic in her chest loosened its grip. Just a fraction. He was strange. He was frightening, but he had defended her name when he didn't have to, and he was freezing so she could sleep. She lay down on the pine needles, pulling the rough wool over her head. The ground was hard, but the fire was warm. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the mountain man who sat guard over her darkness. For the first time in years, she slept without a chair wedged against the door. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the eastern peaks when they reached the ridge, painting the snowfields in bruised shades of violet and rose. The air here was so thin it felt sharp in the lungs, a cold knife with every breath. Elara clutched the pommel of her saddle, her legs numb from the ascent, and looked up at her new home. It was not a house. It was barely a shelter. The cabin was a rough, low-slung structure of pine logs, dark with age and weather, snugged tight against a massive granite outcrop that shielded it from the northern wind. The roof was sod and bark, patched in places with fresh timber that looked like raw wounds against the gray wood. A stone chimney listed slightly to the left, leaking a thin ribbon of blue smoke. Around it, the forest had been hacked back, leaving a field of jagged stumps that poked through the lingering snow like rotten teeth. It looked lonely. It looked like a place where a man came to forget the world, or perhaps to die without anyone noticing. Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen crust of the earth. He didn't look at her, but reached up to help her down. His hands were firm on her waist for a fleeting second before he stepped back, creating distance between them as if the air itself was a barrier he dared not cross. "It is not much," Silas said, His voice rough. He was looking at the cabin, not her. Roof holds tight. Fire draws well. It keeps the bears out. Alara smoothed her skirts, though they were hopelessly wrinkled and stained with trail dust. "It will do," she said, though a hollow ache opened in her chest. He pushed the door open. It swung on leather hinges with a groan. The interior was dim, lit only by the embers in the hearth and the pale light filtering through the open door. It was one room. The floor was packed earth, swept clean but uneven. In the corner stood a narrow bed, the frame made of peeled branches, covered with a buffalo robe. A rough-hewn table sat near the single window, flanked by 2 stump stools. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with well-oiled traps, jars of rendered fat, boxes of cartridges, and coils of rope. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softening touches. It was a space carved out for survival, stripped of any comfort that might suggest joy. It smelled of wood smoke, curing leather, and the heavy, musk-like scent of a man living alone. Silas walked to the hearth and stirred the fire, adding a split log. The sparks flew up, illuminating the starkness of his life. "I will sleep on the floor," he said abruptly, his back to her. "There is a pallet I use in trapping season. I will set it by the hearth." Alara looked at the single narrow bed. It was small, barely wide enough for one, let alone 2 strangers. The intimacy of the room pressed in on her. "You are the husband," Alara said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "The bed belongs to you." "You are the one who rode 2,000 miles, Silas countered, turning to face her. His eyes were shadowed. "And you are the one not used to sleeping on hard ground. You take the bed. That is the end of it." The tension in the room was thick, a physical weight. They were married by law, bound by a signature and a transaction, but they were strangers standing in a 12 by 12 box in the middle of a wilderness. The question of what a husband and wife were supposed to do hung in the silence, heavy and unspoken. "We should speak of terms," Silas said, leaning against the stone of the fireplace. He looked large in the small room, taking up too much space. Alara clasped her hands in front of her, bracing herself. She remembered the terms of her employment back east. She remembered the terms Mr. Sterling had tried to dictate in the dark of the pantry. "Terms," she repeated. "I am a hard man." Silas said quietly, "I have lived rough for a long time. I do not have soft words, but I promise you this, Alara. I will never lay a hand on you in anger. I will never starve you while I have food. I will provide the wood and the meat." He paused, his dark eyes fixing on hers. "And I will expect you to do your share, to cook, to mend, to keep this place from falling into the dust. And I expect you to stay. I put my name on the line for you. I will not have you running back to town the first time the snow flies." Alara met his gaze. He offered safety and labor. He did not offer affection. That was a relief so profound it nearly made her knees buckle. "I am not afraid of work," Alara said, her voice steady. "And I have nowhere to run to. Silas, the world down there has no place for me. I promise to keep your home and do my part. I will not leave." "Good," Silas grunted. "Then we are agreed." Neither of them mentioned love. Neither of them mentioned the nights. It was a treaty between 2 wounded nations, establishing borders and trade, nothing more. The days that followed were a brutal education. The mountain did not care that Alara was city-bred. It did not care that her hands were suited for needlepoint and silk, not cast iron and frozen rope. The altitude was a constant enemy. The air was so thin that simply walking from the creek with a bucket of water left her gasping, black spots dancing in her vision. Her heart would hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird, terrifying her until she learned to move slowly, to breathe deep and deliberate. Routine set in, forged in iron and ice. Silas would vanish before dawn, checking his lines, leaving Alara to wake in the gray light. She would stoke the fire, the cold of the cabin biting through her nightdress, and begin the day's labor. Baking bread in the smoke-stained Dutch oven was a battle. The fire had to be just right, too hot, and the bottom burned to charcoal while the inside remained raw dough. Too cool, and it sat like a stone. She burned her fingers daily, her skin turning red and peeling. Washing clothes was a torment she had never imagined. She had to haul water from the creek, heating it in a copper boiler over the fire. When she carried the wet, heavy woolens outside to hang on the line stretched between two pines, the wind would snatch at the fabric, snapping it like a whip. By the time she pinned a shirt, the sleeves would be stiffening with ice. Her fingers turned white and numb, aching with a deep, bone-crushing throb that made her want to weep. But she bit her lip and finished. She would not let him see her cry. One afternoon, a week after their arrival, Silas returned early to find her by the wood pile. She was struggling with the axe, trying to split a piece of stubborn, knotty pine for kindling. She swung the axe with all her might, but the blade bounced off the wood, the handle jarring her arms all the way to her shoulders. She let out a cry of frustration, wiping hair from her sweaty forehead with a dirty hand. "You are fighting the wood!" a voice rumbled behind her. Elara jumped, nearly dropping the axe. Silas was standing there, watching her. He had moved so silently she hadn't heard him approach. "I can do it," she said quickly, breathless. "It is just a knot." "You are gripping too tight," Silas said, stepping closer. "And your feet are wrong. If the axe glances, you will take your own leg off." He moved in behind her. "Here." He didn't take the axe from her. Instead, he reached around, covering her small hands with his large, scarred ones on the hickory handle. Elara froze. He was suddenly everywhere, his chest a solid wall against her back, his arms caging her, the smell of him encompassing her world. He smelled of pine resin, cold air, dried tobacco, and the musk of labor. It was not unpleasant. It was overwhelming. "Spread your feet," he murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest against her shoulder blade. "Shoulder width. Give yourself a base." She obeyed, her legs trembling. "Loosen the grip," he instructed, his fingers adjusting hers. His skin was rough like sandpaper, warm and dry. "Let the weight of the head do the work. You just guide it." "Like this?" she whispered, her voice barely working. "Like this." He guided her arms up. They moved as one entity. For a second, the awareness of his body pressed against hers was absolute. She could feel the heat radiating from him, piercing through the layers of her dress and his buckskins. A strange jolt of electricity, sharp and terrifying, shot through her. It was not the fear she had felt with Mr. Sterling. It was something else, a sudden, dizzying sense of being held, of being anchored. They swung the axe down together. The blade bit true, splitting the pine with a clean crack. The halves fell away. Silas didn't move immediately. For a heartbeat, 2, 3, he stayed there, his hands over hers, his chin brushing the top of her head. The silence stretched, charged and vibrating. Elara stopped breathing, waiting, her heart thundering so loud she was sure he could feel it against his own chest. Then, as if he had touched a hot stove, Silas jerked back. He stepped away quickly, putting 6 feet between them. His face was tight, a flush rising on his cheekbones above the beard. He looked shaken. That is the way of it," he stammered, his voice tight. "Don't fight the grain. I have traps to oil." He turned and strode toward the shed, moving faster than necessary. Elara stood by the woodpile, gripping the axe handle, her hands still tingling where his had been, staring at the split wood and trying to understand why the cold air suddenly felt so empty. Spring in the mountains was a liar. It offered sunshine in the morning and murder in the afternoon. 2 weeks in, a storm swept down from the north without warning. The temperature plunged 30 degrees in an hour. The wind rose to a shriek, battering the cabin like a giant fist. Snow, hard as pellets, drove horizontally against the logs. Inside, the cabin was freezing. The wind found every chink in the mud daubing, sending icy drafts slicing through the room. The fire roared in the hearth, but its heat was sucked away before it reached the corners. Elara sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in her shawl and 2 blankets, shivering violently. Her teeth chattered with a sound like dry bones clicking together. The cold seemed to be in her marrow. Silas sat by the fire, mending a snowshoe. He looked over at her, watching the tremors rack her small frame. He looked at the pallet on the floor, where the drafts were worst, sweeping along the packed earth. He set the snowshoe down. He picked up a piece of wood and turned it over in his hands, wrestling with himself. He had made a promise. He had drawn a line. "Elara," he said. She looked up, her lips pale blue. Yes? This cold. It is going to get worse before morning," he said, not meeting her eyes. "The floor is no good tonight. You are freezing. I am fine," she lied, hugging herself. "You are not," he said flatly. He stood up. "We need to share the bed, just for warmth. We can pile the buffalo robe on top." Elara stiffened. The bed, the narrow space, the memories of men who claimed they only wanted to comfort her. I can stay by the fire," she said, panic rising. "The fire is dying down, and I cannot keep it roaring all night without burning through our winter cord," Silas said. He looked at her then, his expression open and painfully honest. "I am not asking for anything. Elara, I am trying to keep you from getting sick. Body heat is the only thing that will beat this wind." She looked at the window, where the shutters were rattling as if something wanted to break in. She looked at him. He stood with his hands open, making no move toward her. "Just sleep?" she asked, her voice small. "Just sleep," he promised. "I will keep to my side. You keep to yours." "All right," she whispered. "But we sleep. That is all." That is all. They prepared for bed in silence, turning their backs to each other to undress down to their underthings. When they climbed into the narrow bed, the mattress groaned. They lay back to back, a wall of rigid tension between them. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, her body stiff as a board. She felt the mattress dip under his weight. She felt the line of his back, inches from hers. It was terrifying, but it was also warm. The heat radiating from him was incredible. It soaked into the cold space between them, warming the air under the heavy buffalo robe. Slowly, the shivering that had racked her body began to subside. Her teeth stopped chattering. The wind howled outside, a demon screaming for entry. A sudden, violent gust slammed the heavy shutter against the log wall with a sound like a gunshot. Elara gasped, her body jerking in a reflex of pure fear. Instinctively, without thinking, Silas reached back. His large hand found hers in the darkness under the covers. He didn't pull her. He didn't grab. He just covered her hand with his, a solid, heavy anchor in the storm. "It is just the wind," he rumbled, his voice deep and close. "The latch is loose. It cannot get in." Elara didn't pull away. Her fingers, trembling, curled slightly, catching the side of his thumb. They lay there, linked by that single point of contact, while the storm raged. She felt the calluses on his palm. She felt the steady, slow beat of his pulse in his wrist. He did not let go, and for the first time in a very long time, Elara did not feel alone in the dark. Morning brought a silence as heavy as the snow. When they woke, they were still hand in hand. They pulled apart quickly, stumbling out of bed with averted eyes, faces burning. I will get water," Silas muttered, grabbing the pail and fleeing the cabin. "I will start the bread," Elara said to the empty room. But the air between them had changed. The terrified distance was gone, replaced by a thread of trust, thin, taut, but unbroken. He had kept his word. He had held her hand and asked for nothing. A week later, the snow melted enough for a trip to town. They needed salt and grain. The descent was easier than the ascent, but Elara's stomach twisted with dread as the roofs of Pine Hollow came into view. She hated the town. She hated the eyes. They tied the horses at the hitching rail. Silas walked with a heavy, protective grace, staying close to her shoulder. In the dry goods store, the atmosphere was poisonous. Henderson, the storekeeper, served them in sullen silence, slamming items onto the counter. But it was when they walked to the milliner's shop for thread that the blow fell. A woman in a silk dress, the wife of the town doctor, was coming out as they went in. She had a small girl in tow. When she saw Elara, she stopped dead. She grabbed her daughter's arm and yanked her violently to the side, pressing the child's face into her skirts. "Look away! Clara," the woman hissed, loud enough for the entire street to hear. "Do not look at her." "Why, Mama?" the girl asked. "Because she is a soiled woman," the mother said, her voice dripping with venom. "A mail-order bride is no better than a prostitute. We do not associate with trash." Alara stopped as if she had been shot. The word prostitute echoed in her head, bouncing off the storefronts. It dragged her back to the boarding house, to the whispers in the hallway, to the policemen sneering at her. The shame was a hot wave, scorching her skin. She flinched, shrinking in on herself, waiting for the ground to swallow her. She felt Silas move. It wasn't a fast movement. It was the slow, tectonic shift of a mountain. He stepped past her, blocking the sun, blocking the woman's view of Alara. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at a man standing nearby, a miner who had laughed and muttered, "That's right, mountain man's whore." Silas walked up to the miner. He was 3 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier. He invaded the man's space until they were nose to nose. "What did you say?" Silas asked. His voice was not loud. It was a low, vibrating growl, like stones grinding together deep underground. The miner faltered, his grin vanishing. I didn't mean nothing. Silas." "You called my wife a name," Silas said. "I want you to hear me very clearly. If I ever hear that word come out of your mouth again, or anyone else's, in reference to her, I will break your jaw, and then I will break your arm. Do you understand me?" The miner swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. I understand. Silas turned his gaze to the doctor's wife. She went pale, clutching her daughter, and hurried away without a word. The street went silent. The mockery evaporated, replaced by a wary respect or fear. Silas turned back to Alara. His face was still hard, his eyes blazing with a residual fury. But when he spoke to her, his voice dropped. "Are you done here?" "Yes," Alara whispered, her hands shaking in the folds of her dress. "Please, let's go home." They rode back up the mountain in silence. Alara stared at his back, the broad shoulders, the worn buffalo coat. He was a violent man. She realized, but he had directed his violence at the world to shield her. That night, after supper, Alara cleared her throat. Silas was oiling a trap by the fire. "Thank you," she said stiffly, "for what you did today. You didn't have to." Silas didn't look up. He scrubbed a spot of rust with a rag. "I did have to. You are my wife. You carry my name. No one insults you." "Still," she said, "thank you." "It was nothing," he muttered, but his hands were shaking slightly as he worked the rag. Inside, he was reeling. The rage he had felt. It wasn't just pride. It wasn't just duty. When that man had insulted her, Silas had felt a desire to kill that scared him. He wanted to protect her not because he owned her, but because the thought of her pain made his own chest ache. Summer arrived in a rush of green. The wildflowers exploded across the meadows. Columbine, Indian paintbrush, larkspur. The world softened. They worked side by side now. A team. They repaired the split rail fences around the small garden plot Alara had started. They hauled firewood, stacking it high against the cabin wall, a fortress against the coming winter. The landscape was beautiful, but it was a predator. One afternoon, hailstones the size of robin's eggs pummeled the valley, bruising their arms as they ran for cover. Another day, the creek flooded, nearly washing away their water barrels, and there were beasts. Alara was hanging laundry near the tree line, humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years. The sun was warm on her back. She reached for a clothespin, and the birds suddenly went silent. A deep, chuffing sound came from behind her. She turned slowly. 30 feet away, a black bear stood on its hind legs, sniffing the air. It was massive, its fur shaggy and brown-black, its claws long and curved. It dropped to all fours and woofed, taking a step toward her. Terror, cold and absolute, froze Alara in place. She couldn't scream. She couldn't run. She stared into the small, dark eyes of the animal, knowing she was about to die. Crack! The rifle shot was deafening. It echoed off the rock face. The bear bawled, dirt kicking up inches from its paws where the bullet struck. It spun around, startled by the noise and the stinging earth, and bolted back into the dark timber, crashing through the brush. Silas came running from the woodpile, cycling the lever of his Winchester, his face gray with fear. "I told you!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He reached her, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her slightly. "I told you to keep the rifle with you, always! Do you want to be killed? Do you think this is a game?" He was angry. He was furious. But Alara looked at his hands gripping her arms. They were trembling violently. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown out. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. Alara didn't pull away. She reached up and cupped his face with both of her hands. His stubble was rough against her palms. "Silas," she said softly. "Silas, look at me." He stopped shouting. His chest heaved. He stared down at her, his breathing ragged. "I didn't mean to frighten you," she whispered. "I am sorry." The anger drained out of him, leaving him raw. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes. They were so close. The adrenaline was pounding in his blood, mixing with something else, the sheer, overwhelming relief that she was alive. He leaned in. She didn't pull back. Her eyes fluttered shut. His face hovered inches from hers, his breath hot on her skin. He wanted to kiss her. God, he wanted to kiss her. He wanted to pull her against him and crush the fear out of both of them. But the memory of her flinching in town, the knowledge of her past, held him back. He was a big, scarred man. She was fragile. He could not take. He pulled back abruptly, stepping out of her reach. "Check the traps," he muttered, turning away, his voice hoarse. "I have to check the traps." He walked away fast, leaving her standing in the sunlight, her hands still warm from his skin. The nightmares came for him 2 nights later. It was deep night. The cabin was dark. Alara woke to a sound of strangled shouting. "No, Thomas, get down!" Silas was thrashing in the bed beside her. He was fighting an invisible enemy, his limbs flailing. He struck the wall with his fist, hard. "Silas!" Alara sat up, terrified. "Silas, wake up!" He didn't hear her. He was back in the mud of Antietam. "Don't leave me, Thomas!" Alara hesitated only a second. She reached out and grabbed his shoulders. "Silas, you're safe! Wake up!" He gasped, his eyes flying open but seeing nothing. He lunged up, grabbing her, pulling her into a desperate embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his body shaking with deep, racking tremors. He was sobbing, dry, harsh sobs that tore at his throat. "I've got you," she whispered, stroking his tangled hair. "I'm here. I'm here." He clung to her like a drowning man. His breath was hot and wet against her skin. Slowly, the tension began to leave his muscles. He realized where he was. He realized he was holding his wife. He didn't let go. He couldn't. "My brother," he rasped into the darkness, his voice broken. "Thomas, he was 18. I told him to keep his head down. I told him I would watch him." Alara held him tighter. "He died in my arms," Silas whispered. "He bled out in the cornfield. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't save him." He pulled back slightly, looking at her in the moonlight. "And she left. Mary. She said I came back a ghost. She said she couldn't marry a dead man. Maybe she was right." Alara felt tears sliding down her own cheeks. She knew that feeling, the feeling of being discarded, of being too broken to be loved. "She was wrong," Alara said fiercely. "You are not a ghost, Silas. You are here. You are alive." She almost told him then. She almost told him about Mr. Sterling, about the trial, about the lies. The words were right there on her tongue. "I was ruined too. I was thrown away too." But she stopped. She looked at his face, so open and vulnerable. What if he changed? What if he heard her story and saw the horror the town saw? What if this fragile safety shattered? She swallowed the words. She just held him. "Go to sleep," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere." They lay back down. Not back to back this time, but facing each other, their legs entangled. His arm draped heavily over her waist. Their days settled into a fragile rhythm. They shared chores, passing the water bucket with grazing fingers. They shared quiet meals, Silas occasionally making a dry joke that made Alara smile. But the nights were a slow-burning torment. They lay in the dark, inches apart, the heat between them undeniable. They both wanted more. Alara wanted to be touched with tenderness. Silas wanted to claim the woman who had become his world. But fear held them paralyzed. Fear of the past, fear of rejection, fear of breaking the delicate glass house they had built against the storm. They drifted toward sleep, bodies aching for what they dared not ask for, safe yet starving. The aspen leaves turned first, igniting the slopes in trembling drifts of gold that shivered against the dark, permanent green of the pines. Then the scrub oak flared red, a bloody rust creeping down the canyon walls. The air grew brittle, losing the softness of summer and gaining a metallic edge that tasted of coming frost. Silas Blackwood moved with a frantic, focused energy, and Alara matched him step for step. There was no time for idleness. The mountain winter did not negotiate. It simply killed the unprepared. They spent their days harvesting the land. Silas brought down 2 elk in the high meadows, and for 3 days, the cabin smelled of blood and iron as they dressed the meat. Alara learned to strip the sinew and render the fat into tallow for candles. She learned to smoke the strips of venison over a low fire of hickory and apple wood until her hair smelled like a smokehouse and her hands were stained brown. But it was in the quiet moments of a labor that the shift between them became undeniable. Silas taught her to set snares for snowshoe hares along the game trails. He showed her how to read the signs, the nipped buds on the willow, the packed depressions in the grass. He did not treat her like a child or a burden. He treated her like a partner. One afternoon, a hawk shadowed the clearing, and the squirrels chattered a warning. Alara stood near the woodpile, the light rifle Silas had given her resting in the crook of her arm. A large hare darted from the brush, freezing for a split second near the stump. Alara did not hesitate. She raised the rifle, exhaled half a breath just as Silas had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gunshot rolled down the valley. The hare tumbled and lay still. Silas was splitting wood 10 yards away. He stopped, the axe resting on the block. He looked at the hare, then at Alara. A slow, genuine smile broke through his beard, not the guarded, half-grimace she was used to, but a look of pure, unmasked pride. "Clean shot," he said. "I aim low," she said, lowering the rifle, her heart beating fast with the thrill of competence. "You aim true," Silas corrected. "We will eat well tonight." He watched her walk to retrieve the game, noticing the way she moved now. The city stumble was gone. She walked with her weight forward, eyes scanning the ground, moving through the timber with a grace that belonged to the high country. She was becoming part of the mountain. The nights grew longer, forcing them indoors earlier. The fire became the center of their world again. It was on a Tuesday evening, with the wind whining around the eaves, that the dam finally broke. They were shelling dried beans into a tin bucket, the rhythmic ping, ping, ping the only sound in the room. Alara stopped working. She stared into the flames, her hands still. The silence stretched until it became heavy. "You asked me once," she said softly, "why I had no illusions left?" Silas looked up. He set his handful of beans down carefully. "I remember. There was a man," Alara said. She did not look at him. "In Boston, Mr. Sterling. He owned a fine shop, silks, imported lace. He hired me as a seamstress. It was a good position. I thought I was lucky." Silas said nothing, but his posture shifted. He sat straighter, his stillness becoming intense. "He was kind at first," she continued, her voice flat, fatherly. "Then he began to find reasons to keep me late. Inventory, mending a tear in a bolt of cloth. He would stand too close. He would brush against me in the storeroom. Accidents. He called them—" She picked up a dried pod and crushed it, the shell crumbling in her fingers. "He told me I owed him," she whispered. "He said he had given me a chance when others would not. He said a woman in my position should be grateful. When I pulled away, he would dock my pay. He would tell the other girls I was slow or sloppy. Silas's jaw clenched. The muscles in his forearms corded as his hands fisted on his knees. He knew the type of man, the type who used power like a bludgeon, but wrapped it in velvet. "Did he hurt you?" Silas asked. His voice was very low, very gentle, a stark contrast to the violence in his eyes. "Not in the way you mean, not then," Elara said. "But when I finally told him to stop, when I threatened to leave, he destroyed me. He spread the word that I was loose, that I stole from the till, that I invited men into the back room." She looked up at Silas then, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "In a city like that, a woman's reputation is her currency. Silas, he spent mine until I was bankrupt. The other shop owners wouldn't hire me. My landlady looked at me with disgust. Men on the street began to speak to me differently, because they thought I was what he said I was." Silas felt a murderous heat rising in his chest. He wanted to find this Sterling. He wanted to tear the civilized world apart brick by brick. But he stayed seated. He knew that his rage, if unleashed now, might frighten her. "I ended up in a boarding house," she finished, her voice trembling. "Scrubbing floors, and even there, the whispers followed. I was the fallen woman, the thief, the harlot." She dropped her face into her hands, shaking. "I am sorry," she choked out. "I should have told you. You married a scandal." The chair scraped against the floorboards. Silas moved across the small space. He knelt before her, not touching her, just bringing himself to her level. "Elara," he said. She wouldn't look up. "Elara, look at me." She raised her tear-streaked face. "You listen to me," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did not steal anything. You did not sell yourself. You survived. You fought a battle against a man with all the powder and all the high ground, and you are still standing." He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before placing his large, warm hands on her knees. "That does not make you a scandal," he said firmly. "That makes you brave, braver than half the men I served with." The word broke her. Brave. No one had ever called her that. They had called her stubborn, or difficult, or loose. Never brave. A sob ripped from her throat. She leaned forward, sliding off the chair, and collapsed against him. Silas caught her. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her shaking frame. He held her as if she were made of glass, yet with a strength that promised nothing could reach her. "I have you," he murmured into her hair. "I have you." Elara buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt. She smelled the wood smoke and the man, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely, completely safe. She let the grief of 3 years pour out of her. Slowly, the sobbing subsided. The room grew quiet again. Save for the popping of the fire, they stayed on the floor, entangled. The atmosphere shifted. The comfort began to change, heating up into something sharper. Elara became aware of the hardness of his chest, the heavy beat of his heart against her ear. She felt the strength of his arms, not just as a shield, but as an embrace. She lifted her head. Silas was looking down at her. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. His breath was coming faster, stirring the loose strands of hair at her temple. He wanted to kiss her. The desire was a physical ache in his chest, but the story she had just told him, the story of men taking, of men forcing, held him back like a chain. He brought one hand up, his thumb grazing her cheekbone, wiping away a tear. His fingers were rough, but his touch was agonizingly tender. "Elara," he whispered. His voice was a wreck. "I want to kiss you. God knows I do, but I need to know. Do you want me close, or do you just feel safe because I'm the only wall between you and the winter?" Elara stared at him. The question hung in the air, revolutionary and stunning. "Do you want? Not you owe, not you will." She looked at his scar, at the gray in his beard, at the dark eyes that watched her with such terrifying vulnerability. She realized then that she didn't just need him for survival. She wanted him. She wanted the fire that was in him. I want you, she whispered. Her voice was steady. You, Silas. Not just any man. You. Silas let out a breath that sounded like a groan. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips touched hers, it was tentative. A question asked in silence. Ilara answered it. She made a small sound in her throat and pressed closer, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders. The kiss deepened. It wasn't the practiced, demanding kiss of a city suitor. It was raw. It tasted of coffee and longing. Silas's thumb brushed her jaw, tilting her head back. For a moment, the world narrowed to the point of contact between them. It felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of a precipice, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Then Silas pulled back. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "If we keep on," he rasped, "I will not be able to stop." I do not know if I want you to stop," Ilara admitted, her face flushing. "We wait," Silas said, though it clearly cost him to say it. He smoothed her hair back. "We take our time. You are not a conquest. Ilara, we build this right." They pulled apart, breathless and dizzy. They returned to the beans, but their hands brushed constantly, and every glance was charged with a new, secret electricity. The peace lasted 4 days. It was shattered by the sound of hooves on the rocky trail. Silas was outside chopping wood. Ilara was scrubbing the skillet. They both froze. Visitors were rare, and rarely good news. A rider emerged from the trees. It was a deputy from Pine Hollow, a man named Miller with a pinched face and eyes that measured everything in terms of cost. Silas set the axe down. He walked to the porch, placing himself between the rider and the door. Ilara stepped out behind him, drying her hands on her apron. "Miller," Silas greeted, his voice cold. "Blackwood." The deputy nodded. He didn't dismount. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded paper. "Got a letter here. Came in on the stage yesterday. Marked urgent. Sheriff thought you ought to see it." Silas took the letter. He didn't open it. "Who is it from?" "Lawyer back east," Miller said. He looked past Silas to Ilara. His gaze was cold, speculative. "And a man named Sterling." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She grabbed the door frame to keep from falling. "Says there's a woman," Miller continued, his voice taking on a nasty, officious edge. "Says she robbed her employer. Says she's a fugitive, a thief and a harlot who fled justice." "Watch your mouth," Silas warned, stepping forward. "Just reading the mail. Blackwood," Miller said, holding up a hand. "Letter says there's a reward, $50 for her return. Says she's wanted for questioning regarding theft and moral indecency." Miller looked at Ilara again. "Folks in town are talking. Silas, they're saying you might be harboring a criminal up here. Sheriff wanted me to remind you that aiding a fugitive is a crime." "This is my wife," Silas said, his voice flat and deadly. "She is no fugitive. She is a citizen of this territory. If the law says otherwise," Miller shrugged, gathering his reins, "then she's just a woman on a wanted poster. I'd think on that. $50 is a lot of money." He turned his horse and rode back down the trail, leaving a cloud of dust and silence behind him. Ilara stood frozen. The nightmare had found her. It had climbed the mountain. "Silas," she whispered. She turned and ran back into the cabin. Silas followed her. She was standing by the table, her hands gripping the wood so hard her knuckles were white. She was hyperventilating. "He found me," she gasped. "He found me. He will send men. He will take me back." She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with panic. You have to know it all. Before you decide." "Decide what?" Silas asked calmly, though his heart was hammering. "If you want to keep me," she cried. "The deputy said." "To hell with the deputy," Silas said. "Listen to me," she shouted, hysteria rising. "It wasn't just rumors. The last night, he came into the sewing room. He locked the door. He said I had teased him long enough. He put his hands on me." She was shaking violently. I fought him. I had my sewing scissors. I swung them. I cut his face. A long cut, right down the cheek. He screamed. The housekeeper unlocked the door and saw him bleeding and me holding the scissors. She looked at Silas, pleading for him to understand. He told the police I attacked him. He paid the housekeeper to say I had lured him in there to rob him and cut him when he resisted. They believed him. They were coming to arrest me the next morning. That's why I ran. I am a fugitive. Silas, if they take me back, I will go to prison. She waited. She waited for the look of disgust. She waited for him to tell her that a mountain man couldn't afford a wife with a price on her head. Silas walked over to the fireplace. He threw the unopened letter into the flames. He watched the paper curl and blacken, the words of Mr. Sterling turning to ash. He turned back to her. His face was set in stone. "Let them come," he said. "Silas." "No one," Silas said, his voice quiet but shaking with the force of his vow. "No one drags you off this mountain while I am breathing. I do not care what a piece of paper says. I do not care what the sheriff thinks. You are my wife. You defended your honor against a dog. If that is a crime, then the law is broken, not you." He walked to her and took her face in his hands. "You are safe here," he said. "I swear it on my life." Alara looked at him, and she believed him. But she also saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. The town turned against them with the speed of a rot. When they went down for the final supply run before the deep snow, the atmosphere was poisonous. They walked into Henderson's general store, and the conversation died instantly. Silas placed his order on the counter. Henderson didn't move to fill it. "Cash," Henderson said, staring at the wall. "I have credit here," Silas said, frowning. "I have traded with you for 10 years. You take my furs in the spring." "Not anymore," Henderson said. "Policy change. Cash up front, and I can't spare the flour. Supplies are low." It was a lie. The sacks were stacked high behind him. "You are refusing to sell to me?" Silas asked, his voice dangerous. "I don't do business with folks who harbor wanted women," Henderson muttered. "It's bad for the reputation." Silas slammed his hand on the counter. "She is my wife. She's a liability." "Silas," Henderson snapped, "take your business elsewhere." They left the store empty-handed. On the boardwalk, the preacher's wife, Mrs. Higgins, stood with a group of women as Alara passed. Mrs. Higgins smoothed her skirts and spoke to the air. "Some stains do not wash out," she intoned. "No matter how high up the mountain you crawl." Alara kept her head down, biting her lip until it tasted of copper. "Let's go to the church," Alara said suddenly. Silas stopped. "What?" "It is Sunday," she said, her voice trembling but stubborn. "If we hide, we prove them right. If we walk into God's house, we show them we are not ashamed." Silas looked at her. She was terrified, but she was standing tall. "All right," he said. "We go." It was a mistake. They entered the small, white-steepled church just as the hymn was ending. Every head turned. The silence was absolute. There were no seats left in the back, so Silas marched them to a pew near the front. People scooted away, leaving a foot of empty space on either side of them, as if they carried the plague. The preacher, a thin man with a severe beard, mounted the pulpit. He looked directly at Alara. "Today's sermon," he announced, his voice booming, "is on the sanctity of the home, on the poison of immorality that seeks to hide in our midst. Be sure your sin will find you out, the good book says." He spoke for an hour. He spoke of Jezebels. He spoke of the duty of a community to root out wickedness. He never said her name, but every word was a stone thrown at her face. Alara sat rigid, tears burning her eyes, refusing to let them fall. Silas sat with his arms crossed, staring at the preacher with a look that promised retribution. When the service ended, Alara bolted. She practically ran down the aisle, ignoring the whispers that hissed like snakes from the pews. Silas caught up with her at the wagon. She was shaking so hard she couldn't climb up. He lifted her onto the seat, his hands gentle, his face murderous. That night, the cabin felt small. The silence of the town followed them up the trail. Alara sat on the edge of the bed. Silas was pacing, prowling the room like a caged panther. "You should send me away," Alara said. Silas stopped pacing. "Don't say that." "I'm ruining you," she said, her voice rising. "You had a life here. You had respect. Now you can't even buy flour. They hate you because of me. If I leave, if I go to another territory, do you think I care about their respect?" Silas laughed, a bitter, barking sound. "I never had their respect. Alara, I had their tolerance. I was the wild man on the ridge who brought them furs. They never claimed me, and I do not want them to." "But they will come for me," she cried. "That $50, someone will come." "Let them come," Silas roared. "I will kill them. I don't want you to die for me." She stood up, tears streaming down her face. "I am not worth it. Silas!" He crossed the room in 2 strides. He grabbed her arms, pulling her to him. "You are the only thing worth it," he said fiercely. He kissed her. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a desperate, crushing kiss, born of fear and fury. Alara kissed him back with equal force, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. They clung to each other as if the world were ending. The prejudice, the letters, the hatred, it all vanished, leaving only the heat of their bodies in the firelight. Silas's hands moved down her back, tracing the curve of her spine, pressing her against him. Alara gasped, her body arching into his. The heat spiraled between them, a sudden, blinding flare of need. She wanted to forget everything. She wanted to lose herself in him. She pulled at his shirt, her fingers frantic. Silas groaned, a sound torn from his throat. He pushed her backward toward the bed. They fell onto the mattress, limbs tangled. For a moment, they were just a man and a woman, starving for each other. Then Silas froze. He felt her trembling beneath him. He looked down at her face, flushed and wet with tears, her eyes wide with a mix of desire and terror. He pulled back, gasping for air. He rolled off her, sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "No," he rasped. "No, not like this." Alara lay there, confused, her chest heaving. "Silas?" "Not tonight," he said, his voice shaking. "Not when we are afraid. Not when you are trying to prove you are worth saving. And I am trying to prove I can save you." He turned to look at her. "When I take you to bed, Alara, it will be because we are safe, and because there is nothing else in our minds but us. I will not let fear drive us." Alara lay still. She felt a wash of frustration. Her body was humming, alive, but beneath it, a profound, aching gratitude. He was protecting her even from himself. He was protecting the sanctity of what they were building. She reached out and touched his back. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." The first snow fell 2 days later. It came soft and silent, burying the world in white. Their world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin and the circle of firelight. The trail to town became a treacherous white ribbon, effectively cutting them off. They chose each other in small ways. Silas carved a new handle for her hairbrush, smoothing the wood for hours by the fire. Alara mended his favorite shirt, embroidering a tiny, hidden pine tree on the cuff. They read to each other from the Bible and an old almanac Silas had. They told stories. Silas spoke of his childhood in Ohio. Alara spoke of the ocean, which Silas had never seen. When they touched, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed the coffee pot, it was electric. The promise of what waited for them hung in the air, sweet and heavy. They were ready. They were just waiting for the storm to pass. But down in the valley, a different storm was gathering. A stranger rode into Pine Hollow on a tall black horse. He wore a long duster and a hat pulled low. He walked into the saloon, his spurs jingling, and threw a gold coin on the bar. "Whiskey," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and cruel. He turned to the room. The miners and townsfolk looked at him. "I am looking for a woman," the man said, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A thief. Goes by the name Alara. I hear she's shacked up with a hermit somewhere in these hills." He pulled a thick roll of bills from his pocket. "My employer wants her back," the man said, "and he is willing to pay very well for help in retrieving his property. Who knows the way up the ridge?" Henderson, the storekeeper, looked at the money. He looked at the stranger, and slowly, he began to nod. The first heavy snow of December did not fall. It was driven into the earth like nails. The wind shrieked down from the high peaks, carrying a cold so profound it seemed to stop time itself. The cabin, once a mere shelter, became a ship lost in a white ocean. The logs groaned under the weight of the drifts that piled against the north wall, and the windows frosted over with thick, opaque patterns of ice. Survival was no longer a daily chore. It was a war. Silas moved with a grim determination, and Alara matched him. The world outside was lethal. A man could freeze to death in the time it took to smoke a pipe. "You have to walk wide," Silas shouted over the wind one morning, pointing at Alara's feet. They were standing near the woodpile, the air biting their faces. He had fashioned a pair of snowshoes for her out of ash wood and rawhide. "Lift your knees. If you drag them, you will trip, and in deep powder. Getting up takes energy you do not have." Alara nodded, her breath pluming in a thick cloud. She practiced the gait, lifting the oversized webs, feeling the burn in her hips. "And listen," Silas commanded. He walked her toward the creek, which was now a smooth, white ribbon winding through the trees. He tapped his pole against the snow. It made a solid, dull thud. Then he moved 3 feet to the left and tapped again. This time, the sound was hollow, a drum-like resonance. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "It sounds empty," Alara said. "That is water moving under thin ice," Silas said seriously. "Snow insulates it. If you step there, you go through, you get wet out here, miles from a fire, and you die. The cold takes your mind first, then your heart. You listen for the hollow sound. Alara, always." She learned to read the surface of the snow, to distinguish between the solid drift and the air pocket. She learned to wrap her face in wool until only her eyes were exposed. She was determined not to be a burden. She saw the way Silas looked at the woodpile, measuring the logs against the length of the winter, and she wanted to be an asset, not another mouth to feed. January brought a cold snap that cracked trees. The mercury in Silas's old thermometer dropped so low it buried itself in the bulb. On a Tuesday, the sky was a flat, deceitful gray. Silas was restless. The trap line in the upper ravine hadn't been checked in 3 days, and he worried about wolves getting to the pelts. "I will be back before noon," he told Alara, pulling on his heavy buffalo coat. He checked his rifle and tied his snowshoes. "Keep the fire banked. If the wind changes, bar the door." "Be careful," Alara said. She was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour. She didn't look up, but her voice was tight. "The air feels heavy." "I am always careful," Silas said. He left. The silence of the cabin rushed back in to fill the space where he had been. 2 hours later, the world vanished. It didn't start with snow. It started with wind, a sudden, roaring gust that shook the cabin to its foundation. Then the white came, a blinding wall of blowing snow that erased the trees, the sky, and the horizon. Visibility dropped to the length of an arm. Silas was 3 miles out, navigating the steep edge of the ravine, when the whiteout hit. He stopped, squinting against the stinging ice crystals. He knew the terrain, but the wind was disorienting, swirling from all directions. He turned to head back, planting his pole. The ground beneath his right snowshoe gave way. It was a cornice, a shelf of wind-packed snow hanging over empty air. It crumbled instantly. Silas fell. He didn't scream. He twisted in the air, trying to grab a branch, a root, anything. He hit the slope below hard, tumbling through the brush, bouncing off rocks hidden under the powder. He came to a stop 50 feet down, wedged against a fallen pine. A sickening snap echoed in his ears, louder than the wind. Pain, white and hot, exploded in his left leg. He gasped, sucking in a lungful of freezing snow. He tried to move, and the world tilted. His ribs screamed in agony. He lay there, staring up at the swirling gray nothingness. His leg was twisted at a wrong angle. His chest felt like it had been crushed by a hammer. He tried to stand and collapsed, black spots dancing in his vision. "Get up," he hissed to himself. "Get up, you old fool!" But he couldn't. The cold was already seeping through his buckskins, finding the sweat on his skin, turning it to ice. Back at the cabin, the clock on the mantel ticked. Noon came and went. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. Ilara paced the floor. She went to the window, scraping the frost away with a fingernail. Outside was a churning chaos of white. She couldn't see the woodpile, let alone the trail. Panic began to rise in her throat, tasting of copper. Silas never missed a time. He was clockwork. She waited another hour. The wind howled like a dying animal. "He is hurt," she whispered to the empty room. "He is hurt, and he is alone." She looked at the fire. It was warm, safe. If she went out there, she might die. She didn't know the upper ravine well. The snow was deep. She looked at the empty chair where he sat in the evenings, oiling his traps. She thought of his hands covering hers on the axe handle. She thought of him standing between her and the town, taking the blows meant for her. Ilara went to the pegs on the wall. She put on her heavy wool coat, then Silas's spare canvas duster over it. She wrapped a scarf around her head, covering her nose and mouth. She pulled on thick mittens. She grabbed the coil of heavy rope from the corner and the oil lantern, lighting it despite the daylight, knowing the storm would turn the afternoon to twilight. She opened the door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her backward. She leaned into it, shutting the door behind her, and stepped off the porch. The snow was up to her thighs, even with the snowshoes. Every step was a battle. The wind tried to tear the breath from her lungs. She couldn't see tracks. The wind had scrubbed the world clean, but she knew his route. He followed the creek, then cut up the ridge. She pushed forward. Her legs burned. The cold found the gaps in her scarf, stinging her skin. Left foot, right foot. Don't stop. If you stop, he dies. She reached the creek. The ice was buried. She remembered the lesson. Listen for the hollow sound. She moved slowly, tapping the walking stick she had grabbed. Thud, thud, thud. She crossed safely and started up the incline. The slope was steep. She slipped, falling to her knees, burying her face in the snow. She cried out, tears freezing on her eyelashes. It was too hard. It was too far. "He would come for you," a voice inside her head said. "He would crawl through hell for you." Ilara stood up. She forced her legs to move. She reached the ridgeline an hour later. The wind was worse here, screaming over the edge. She held the lantern up, though its light was feeble against the storm. "Silas!" she screamed. The wind tore the name away. "Silas!" She saw a disturbance in the snow near the edge. A broken branch. A slide mark that hadn't been fully filled in yet. She crept to the edge and looked down. Through a break in the swirling snow, she saw a dark shape wedged against a log far below. Silas! There was no movement. Ilara tied the rope to a sturdy pine tree. She looped the other end around her waist. She didn't rappel, she slid, scrambling down the slope, tearing her coat on briars, half falling until she reached him. He was half buried. His face was pale, his lips blue, his eyes were closed. "Silas!" she sobbed, dropping to her knees. She ripped her glove off and touched his cheek. It was terrifyingly cold. His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. "Ilara," he whispered. "Go back. Too cold. I am not going back without you." She shouted over the wind. She saw the leg. She saw the way he winced when he breathed. She couldn't carry him. He was twice her weight. She uncoiled the rest of the rope. She tied it under his arms, padding the loops with the scarf from her neck. "I have to drag you," she told him, leaning close to his ear. "It will hurt. I am sorry." Silas nodded weakly. He was fading. The climb back up was a nightmare. Ilara scrambled up the slope, hauling on the rope, using the tree above as a pulley. She pulled 10 feet, then braced herself, gasping. her lungs burning like they were filled with glass. Then she pulled again. Silas groaned with every movement, but he tried to push with his good leg, helping her. It took an hour to get him to the ridge. By the time they reached the top, Ilara's hands were cramping into claws, and she couldn't feel her feet. She didn't stop. She lashed him to the crude travois of branches he had left near the trailhead for hauling wood, and she pulled. She became a mule. She became a machine. She put her head down and dragged him through the storm, focusing on nothing but the next step. The cabin door burst open, and snow swirled onto the floor. Ilara dragged Silas inside and kicked the door shut. Barring it, the silence of the room was deafening after the roar of the wind. She fell to her knees beside him. He was shivering violently now, his teeth clattering together with a terrifying sound. Hypothermia. She knew the signs. "We have to get you warm," she gasped. She scrambled to the hearth, throwing logs on the fire until it roared. Then she turned back to him. His clothes were frozen stiff, caked with ice and snow. They were sucking the heat out of him. "I have to cut them," she said, grabbing his hunting knife from his belt. She cut the laces of his boots. She sliced through the heavy leather of his buckskins. She worked frantically, stripping the wet, freezing layers from his body. She didn't look away. There was no room for modesty here. There was only life and death. He was naked, his skin pale and marbled with cold, the scars on his chest standing out in purple relief. His bad leg was swollen, bruising dark. She dragged the mattress from the bed to the front of the fire. She managed to roll him onto it. He was shaking so hard the whole cabin seemed to vibrate with it. He wasn't warming up. The fire wasn't enough. Ilara knew what she had to do. She had heard the stories of how trappers survived when the ice took them. She stood up and stripped off her heavy coat, then her dress, then her shift and stays. She peeled every layer away until she stood shivering in the firelight. She climbed under the heavy buffalo robes and lay down beside him. She pressed her warm, soft body against his freezing, hard one. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling his head onto her chest, weaving her legs with his good one. "I have you," she whispered fiercely, her teeth chattering as his cold seeped into her. "You are not allowed to die. Silas Blackwood, you are not allowed to leave me alone." Silas groaned, his mind lost in the fog of cold, but his body responded to the heat. He turned instinctively toward her, burying his face in her neck, his icy hands clutched at her back. They lay there for hours as the storm raged outside. Ilara rubbed his arms, his back, generating friction. She whispered to him, commanding him to stay. Slowly, the violent shivering eased. His skin began to pinken. His breathing deepened, losing that terrifying hitch. In the darkness under the firs, the boundaries dissolved. There was no mountain man and mail-order bride. There was just flesh and breath and the desperate will to survive. She felt the roughness of his beard against her breast, the weight of his arm over her waist. She realized, with a clarity that cut through the fear, that his presence had become as necessary to her as the air she fought to breathe. The fever came in the night. Silas burned. He tossed on the mattress, crying out in his sleep. "They're flanking us," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Thomas, stay down." Ilara bathed his forehead with cool water. She bound his ribs tight with strips of linen. She splinted his leg as best she could, setting the bone with a sickening crunch that made him scream before he passed out again. He grabbed her wrist in his delirium. His grip was bruising. "Don't go," he begged, looking at her with unseeing eyes. "Mary, don't go." "I am not Mary," Ilara whispered, stroking his hair. "I am Ilara. And I am staying—" "Ilara," he murmured, the name softening on his lips. "Ilara." She didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, feeding it, watching his chest rise and fall. She washed him. She held a cup of water to his cracked lips. She was exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, but she was relentless. On the third morning, the fever broke. Ilara was dozing in the chair, her head resting on the mattress. She felt a hand touch her hair. She jerked awake. Silas was looking at her. His eyes were clear, dark, and deep. He looked at the splint on his leg, then at the pile of cut buckskins in the corner, and finally at her face, haggard with worry. "You came for me," he rasped. His voice was weak, like rust grinding on gravel. "You were late," Alara said, her voice trembling. "I was worried about the stew." Silas didn't smile. He reached out and took her hand. He pulled, weak but insistent. Alara slid from the chair onto the mattress beside him. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I remember," he said softly. "I remember the snow, the rope. You dragged me. You were heavy," she whispered. "And afterward," Silas said, "you kept me warm." Alara flushed, looking down. "It was the only way." "If I am alive," Silas said, squeezing her hand, "it is because you gave me something worth living for. I wanted to let go. Alara, in the snow, it was peaceful. But I heard your voice." He reached up and touched her cheek. "I heard you calling me." Alara leaned into his palm, closing her eyes. A tear slipped out. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," she choked out. Silas pulled her down. Their lips met. It wasn't cautious this time. It wasn't testing the waters. It was deep, unguarded, and desperate. It tasted of life. It was a seal on a contract that had nothing to do with mail-order agencies and everything to do with blood and bone. "We are not just surviving anymore," Silas whispered against her lips. "We are living. Together." It took 6 weeks for the leg to heal enough to ride. When the Chinook winds finally blew warm in March, melting the drifts into slush, Silas saddled the horses. He walked with a heavy limp, leaning on a cane Alara had carved for him. But he was upright. "Where are we going?" Alara asked, watching him pack the saddlebags. "Town," Silas said. He looked at her. "Put on your best dress." "Town?" Alara hesitated. "Silas, you know what they say. You know the danger." "Put on the dress. Alara." They rode down the mountain slowly. Silas rode with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the trees. But his focus wasn't on threats. It was on the destination. They rode straight to the small white church at the end of Main Street. It was a Tuesday. The building was empty save for the Reverend Thomas, who was sweeping the steps. The Reverend looked up, startled. As the mountain man and the woman rode up, he saw Silas's limp. He saw the way Alara watched the street with fearful eyes. "Silas," the Reverend said, leaning on his broom, "I heard you took a fall." "I did," Silas said, dismounting painfully. He helped Alara down. She stood close to him, her hand gripping his arm. "We need a wedding," Silas said bluntly. The Reverend blinked. But you are already married, are you not?" "The papers were signed. The law was satisfied," Silas said. "But we were strangers. We made a deal for winter." He looked down at Alara. "I want to marry my wife," Silas said. "Properly, before God, and before this town. If they have the eyes to see it." The Reverend looked at Alara. He saw the way she held herself, not with the shame of the outcast he had preached about, but with a quiet dignity. He saw the way Silas stood between her and the road. "Come inside," the Reverend said quietly. The ceremony was simple. There was no music. The pews were empty, though the door was open. A few curious townsfolk had gathered on the steps, whispering. The storekeeper, Henderson, watched from across the street. Silas held Alara's hand. His grip was warm and solid. "Do you, Silas, take this woman?" "I do," Silas said. His voice was a rumble of thunder. "For winter and summer, for hunger and plenty." "And do you, Alara?" Alara looked up at his scarred face. She saw the man who had slept on the floor to give her a bed, the man who had faced down a bear, the man who had nearly died to come back to her. "I do," she whispered. "I choose him." Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a ring. It wasn't the plain brass band he had sent with the money. It was gold, old gold, heavy and worn. "It was my mother's," he said softly, sliding it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. As they walked out of the church, the sun broke through the clouds. The group on the steps parted. There were still sneers, still whispers behind hands. But Mrs. Gable, the woman from the stagecoach who had once called her a fallen woman, was standing there. She looked at Alara, then at the ring, then at the way Silas leaned on her for support. Mrs. Gable nodded. A sharp, singular nod of acknowledgement. Alara lifted her chin and nodded back. She was not a piece of property. She was Alara Blackwood. That night, the cabin felt different. It was no longer a shelter against the cold. It was a home. The fire burned low, casting golden light across the room. The wind was gentle outside, a caress rather than a threat. Silas sat on the edge of the bed. Alara stood by the fire, unpinning her hair. It fell in dark waves down her back. She turned to face him. Her heart was hammering, but not with fear, with anticipation. Silas stood up. He walked to her, his cane thumping softly on the floor. He stopped inches away. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw. "I am afraid," he confessed, his voice rough. "Of what?" Alara asked, stepping closer. "Of hurting you," he said. "Of being too rough. I am a bear. Alara, and you have been hurt by men who took what wasn't theirs. You are not them," Alara said firmly. She reached up and unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers brushing the dark hair of his chest. "You could never be them, and I am afraid," she whispered, her hands pausing. "I am afraid that my body remembers things my heart wants to forget. I am afraid I will freeze." "Then we go slow," Silas said. "We go step by step. And if you say stop, the world stops." He bent his head and kissed her neck, a soft, warm brush of lips that sent a shiver down her spine. "May I?" he asked against her skin. "Yes," she breathed. He lifted her, carrying her to the bed. He laid her down as if she were made of porcelain. He lay beside her, not on top of her. He undressed her slowly, his eyes worshipping her skin in the firelight. He touched her scar from the scissors, a faint line on her arm she hadn't told him about. He kissed it. "Beautiful," he murmured. When he finally moved over her, he paused, his weight on his elbows. Keeping the pressure off, he looked into her eyes, searching for fear. "Alara, I am here," she whispered, pulling him down. "I am yours." The act was not a taking, it was a giving. It was a slow, rhythmic conversation of bodies that had kept each other alive through the ice. There was pain, brief and old, but it was washed away by a tenderness so profound it made Alara weep. Silas kissed the tears away, murmuring her name like a prayer. When the release came, it shattered them both, leaving them breathless and clinging to each other in the aftermath. They lay entwined under the heavy blankets, the fire crackling and dying into embers. Silas's arm was heavy over her waist. Alara's head rested on his chest, listening to the slow, strong beat of his heart. She felt claimed, not as property, but as a partner, and for the first time in her life, she felt entirely free. The weeks that followed were a golden time. The snow retreated up the peaks. The creek roared with meltwater. The cabin changed. Alara sewed curtains from a bolt of yellow calico Silas had bought in town. She embroidered wildflowers on the pillowcases. She arranged his tools on the shelves. It was small, but it was theirs. Silas taught her to track elk. He showed her the hidden meadows where the columbine bloomed first. They laughed, a sound the canyon had never heard before. One morning, Alara stood by the window, looking at the greening trees. She pressed a hand to her stomach. Her monthly bleeding was late, 2 weeks late. She felt a wave of dizziness that wasn't from the altitude. A child. Fear spiked in her chest. A baby in this wilderness, with winter always waiting, with the town hating them. But then she looked at Silas, who was sitting on the porch whittling a toy, a small wooden horse. Though he claimed it was just a carving, he looked up and smiled at her, the scar on his face crinkling. A child. A son or a daughter who would know this mountain, who would know a father who would walk through fire for them. She smiled back, keeping the secret for just a little longer. It felt miraculous. Down in Pine Hollow, The snow had turned to mud. The stranger in the duster, the hired man, sat in the sheriff's office. His feet were up on the desk. He was cleaning his fingernails with a knife. Deputy Miller sat opposite him, looking nervous. "You're sure she's up there?" the hired man asked. "Blackwood came down," Miller said, "with the woman. They got married at the church. He's lame, broke a leg in the winter." The hired man smiled. It was a cold, reptilian expression. "Lame, is he?" The man snapped the knife shut. "That makes things easier. And the town, how do they feel about the happy couple?" "They don't like him," Miller said. "Reverend married him, but folks talk. They say she's a whore. They say he's harboring a criminal." "Good," the hired man said, standing up. He tossed a gold coin to the deputy. "Keep the pot stirred. Miller, tell them the woman is dangerous. Tell them she's a witch if you have to. When the snow clears from the high pass, we're going hunting." He walked to the window and looked up at the jagged peaks of the Sawtooth Ridge. "I'm coming for you, Elara," he whispered. "And I'm bringing hell with me." The heavy silence of winter finally broke in early April. It began with a drip of water from the eaves, a rhythmic drumming that turned into a steady, rushing music as the great drifts around the cabin slumped and graying snow gave way to patches of wet, black earth. The creek, silent for months under ice, roared back to life, brown and swollen with meltwater. Silas Blackwood stood on the porch, leaning on his cane, watching the steam rise from the valley floor. His leg had healed enough to bear weight, though the ache was a constant, dull companion, a reminder of the white hell they had survived. "We are low on flour," Elara said, coming to stand beside him. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes scanning the trail that wound down toward the timber line. "And the salt pork is gone." "The trail is mud," Silas said, looking at the sky. It was a brilliant, hard blue, but passable. "We will go tomorrow." Elara hesitated. The town was no longer just a place of commerce. It was a place of judgment. But she looked at Silas, at the gray in his beard and the quiet strength in his stance, and she felt a surge of new courage. She was not the same woman who had arrived on the stagecoach, trembling and ashamed. She was a survivor. She was a wife. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The ride down was slow. The horses picked their way through sucking mud and slush. The air smelled of wet pine needles and rotting leaves, the scent of the earth waking up hungry. When they reached Pine Hollow, the town seemed busier than usual. Wagons were bogged down in the main street, drivers shouting and whipping their teams. Men were gathered in knots on the boardwalks, smoking and talking in low voices. Silas rode with his rifle across his saddle, his eyes moving constantly. He felt the shift in the air before they even reached the livery stable. It was a tightening, a sudden cessation of motion as heads turned to watch them pass. "Keep close," Silas murmured to Elara. They tied the horses at the rail in front of the general store, before Silas could reach for his saddlebags. The door of the sheriff's office opened. Sheriff Brady stepped out, a heavy man with a tired face and a star pinned to a vest that strained at the buttons. He was flanked by Deputy Miller, who wore a look of nervous excitement, his hand hovering near his gun belt. But it was the third man who made Elara's blood turn to ice. He was tall and slender, dressed in a long duster that did not hide the cut of a fine city suit underneath. He wore a clean hat, unmarred by trail dust, and his face was smooth-shaven, pale, and twisted into a smile of predatory satisfaction. It was not Mr. Sterling. It was his fixer, the man who handled the dirty work, Elias Thorne. "Well," Thorne said, his voice smooth and carrying easily over the mud. "The mountain gives up its secrets at last." A crowd began to form instantly, drawn by the confrontation. Miners, shopkeepers, and women with baskets stopped to watch, forming a loose semicircle that pinned the couple against the hitching rail. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice level. "Is there business?" "I'm afraid so." "Silas," Sheriff Brady said, looking uncomfortable. He held up a hand as Silas shifted his weight. "Don't do anything foolish. "We have a warrant." Thorn stepped forward, pulling a folded document from his breast pocket. He snapped it open with a flourish. "Warrant for the arrest of one Elara Vance," Thorn announced, pitching his voice to the crowd. "Wanted in Boston for grand larceny, flight to avoid prosecution, and—" He paused, letting his eyes rake over Elara with a look of mock pity. "Lewd and lascivious conduct. Specifically, the seduction and attempted extortion of her employer, a respected pillar of the community." The crowd murmured. The words seduction and extortion hung in the damp air like smoke. Elara felt the ground sway beneath her feet. The shame was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. She felt every pair of eyes on her, stripping her, judging her, believing the worst. She was back in the boarding house hallway. She was back in the police station. She was naked before their scorn. "She is a dangerous woman," Thorn continued, turning to the townsfolk. "She lures men in with a sad story, gains their trust, and then strikes. She ruined a good man back east, and now she has crawled into your mountains to hide behind a new victim." He pointed a gloved finger at Silas. "This man is harboring a fugitive," Thorn declared. "He has been bewitched by a criminal who uses her body as a weapon." The accusation hung there, ugly and poisonous. Elara shrank back, instinctively reaching for the saddle horn to steady herself. She waited for Silas to step away. She waited for him to see the doubt in the sheriff's eyes and realize the cost of standing beside her. Silas moved. He did not step away. He stepped in front of her. He placed his broad back between Elara and the crowd, effectively cutting off their view of her. He leaned on his cane with his left hand, his right hand resting loosely near his belt, not on his gun, but ready. "You are done talking," Silas said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low rumble, like the sound of ice cracking on a frozen lake. Deep, dangerous, and utterly final. "Step aside, Blackwood," Thorn sneered, though he took a half step back. "The law is clear. That woman is property of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts." "This woman," Silas said, his voice rising just enough to thunder through the street, "is my wife. She is Elara Blackwood. And she is not going anywhere with you." "Silas," Sheriff Brady warned, stepping off the boardwalk. "The papers are in order. The judge has seen them. We have to take her in." "You take her over my dead body," Silas said. The threat was not a bluster. It was a statement of fact. His eyes were dark voids, fixed on the sheriff. "You know me, Brady. You know I do not make idle threats. If you try to put irons on her, you will have to kill me right here in the street." The sheriff hesitated. He knew Silas Blackwood. He knew the man had survived wars and winters that killed lesser men. He looked at the nervous deputy, then at the confident, sneering Thorn. "We don't want blood, Silas," Brady said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "But I can't ignore a warrant from a federal marshal. We have to follow procedure." "Procedure," Silas spat. "A hearing," Brady proposed quickly. "Judge Blackmore is in town. We hold a hearing today. Determine the validity of the warrant. Let the lady speak her piece." "She stays with me," Silas demanded. "She has to be in custody until the hearing," Brady insisted. "That is the law. Silas, I can't bend it that far." Silas looked at the crowd, then at Thorn, who was smiling again. He turned his head slightly, speaking over his shoulder to Elara. "I will not leave you," he whispered. He turned back to the sheriff. "Then lock us both up. I am responsible for her. If she goes to the jail, I go too." "Silas, you ain't charged with nothing yet," Brady protested. "I am obstructing justice. Am I not?" Silas challenged. "Arrest me. Put us in the back. But if you try to separate us, I will start a war you cannot finish." The sheriff sighed, defeated. "All right, both of you. To the jailhouse. But no guns." Silas handed his rifle and belt to the sheriff slowly. He kept his cane. They walked to the jailhouse under the gaze of the town. Thorn watched them go, lighting a cigar, his eyes bright with triumph. The jailhouse was a small brick building that smelled of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and damp stone. There were 2 cells in the main block, both empty. and a small room in the back used for storage and temporary holding, separated from the office by a heavy iron-barred door. The sheriff ushered them into the back room. It was cramped, filled with crates of ammunition and confiscated saddles. There was a single narrow bunk against the wall. The heavy clang of the iron door closing echoed in Alara's bones. She stood in the center of the room, trembling violently. The walls seemed to be closing in. The small, barred window high on the wall let in a square of merciless light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. "Trapped!" she whispered. "I am trapped!" It was the sewing room all over again. The lock clicking, the heavy footsteps approaching. Silas saw the panic rising in her eyes, the way her pupils dilated, her breathing becoming shallow and fast. He dropped his cane and reached for her, pulling her into his arms. "Look at me," he commanded gently. "Alara, you are not there. You are here, with me. They are going to take me back." She sobbed into his coat. "Thorn, he is the devil. Silas, he fixes things. He makes truth disappear. He will take me back to Sterling, and they will lock me away until I rot." "They will have to go through me," Silas said, holding her tight. "And I am a hard man to get through." They sat on the narrow bunk as the afternoon wore on. The sun moved across the floor. The sounds of the town filtered in, muffled voices, the rumble of wagons, but they felt a world away. In the dim light, Alara finally spoke the full truth. She told him the things she had been too ashamed to say before. "It wasn't just the touching," she whispered, her voice hollow. "That last night, he had a rope. He said if I wouldn't be willing, I would be compliant. He had planned it. Silas. He had told the staff to leave early." Silas went rigid against her. His hand, which had been stroking her hair, stopped. "He tried to tie me," she said, shuddering. "That was when I grabbed the scissors. I didn't mean to cut his face. I aimed for his neck. I wanted to kill him." She looked up at Silas, terrified of what she would see. "Attempted murder. I wanted him dead," she confessed. Silas turned his face to hers. His expression was not one of horror. It was a mask of icy, focused rage. A cold fury that burned hotter than any fire. "You should have killed him," Silas said quietly. "Silas? A man who brings a rope to a woman is not a man," Silas said. "He is a rabid dog. You did what you had to do to survive." He took her hands in his. His grip was iron. "I swear to you," he said, his voice vibrating with intensity, "that man will never touch you again. If the law fails us, I will not. I will take you so far into the mountains that no map can find us. Or I will kill Thorn and Sterling and hang for it. But you will not go back." The hearing was set for 4 o'clock in the meeting hall. The room was packed. It seemed the entire population of Pine Hollow had squeezed onto the wooden benches. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool, sweat, and anticipation. Judge Blackmore sat at a table on the raised platform. He was a man who prided himself on his silver hair and his connections to Eastern capital. He looked at Silas and Alara with open disdain. Thorn stood near the front, looking relaxed and confident. He presented his case with the slick professionalism of a man who knew the outcome was already bought. He called witnesses. The first was a man Alara didn't know, a drifter who claimed to have seen Alara in St. Louis, working a brothel. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But the man told it with a straight face, spitting tobacco juice into a cuspidor for emphasis. "She was wild," the drifter said, grinning, "known for robbing her customers." The second witness was the miner Silas had threatened months ago. He took the stand with a smug look at Silas. "She's a seductress. Judge." The miner lied. "I seen her in town, flashing eyes at men, trying to get free goods. She bewitched that mountain man. Everyone knows Silas was a hermit till she got her claws in him." Each lie was a lash. Alara sat with her head bowed, her hands gripping her skirt. The humiliation was total. They were painting a portrait of a monster, and the town was eating it up. "Mrs. Blackwood," the judge said, his voice bored, "you may speak in your defense, though I warn you, flight from prosecution is an admission of guilt in the eyes of many." Alara stood up, Her knees knocked together. She looked at the sea of hostile faces. She saw Mrs. Higgins, the preacher's wife, looking at her with self-righteous triumph. She saw Henderson sneering. She couldn't do it. Her throat closed. The words died on her tongue. Then she felt a hand on her elbow. Warm, steady. Silas didn't look at the crowd. He looked at her. He squeezed her arm. A silent transfer of strength. "I am here. You are brave." Alara took a breath. She looked at the judge. "I am not what they say," she said. Her voice was quiet, shaking, but it carried in the hushed room. "Speak up," the judge snapped. "I am not a thief," Alara said louder. "I worked for Mr. Sterling for 3 years. I was the head seamstress. I worked 12 hours a day. I never took a penny that wasn't my wage." She paused, swallowing hard. "And I am not a harlot," Mr. Sterling demanded. "Favors. He said it was the price of keeping my job. When I refused, he punished me. When I tried to leave, he attacked me." She looked directly at Thorne. "He tried to force me," she said clearly. "I fought back. That is my crime. I said no to a rich man." The room shifted. A few people looked down, uncomfortable. The simplicity of her words cut through the theatrical lies of the witnesses. Thorne sensed the shift. He stepped forward quickly. "She is a skilled actress, Your Honor," Thorne said smoothly. "She has clearly manipulated this poor, simple mountain man into believing her fantasies. She has bewitched him into obstructing justice." Silas stood up. The sound of his chair scraping back was loud. He walked to the center of the room, limping slightly. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the town. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He spoke like a man who had spent 20 years listening to the wind and the silence. "I am not a simple man," Silas said, "and I am not bewitched." He looked at the miner who had testified. The man shrank back. "I fought in the war," Silas said. "I saw fields of dead boys. I saw men with gold stars on their shoulders send good men to die for their own glory. I know what power does to the weak. I know how easy it is for a man with money to crush a woman with none." He turned to the judge. "You call her ruined. You call her fallen. I have lived with this woman through a winter that would kill any of you. I have seen her haul me out of a snowslide when she could have left me to die. I have seen her work until her hands bled to keep a home." His voice grew rough, thick with emotion. "She is the finest, bravest soul I have ever known. And if loving her and standing between her and a pack of liars is a crime, then you can lock me up, because I will not stand aside. Not today. Not ever." Silence filled the hall. It was a heavy, stunned silence. The raw sincerity of his words, the sheer force of his conviction, cracked the certainty of the town. Henderson, the storekeeper, looked at his boots. The sheriff looked at the ceiling. "Touching," Thorne drawled, breaking the spell. "But irrelevant. The law is the law." "Wait!" a voice called out from the back of the room. A woman stood up. It was Mrs. Gable, the severe woman from the stagecoach, the one who had called Alara a woman who sells herself. She walked to the front, her back stiff. "I wish to speak, Mrs. Gable said. "This is highly irregular," the judge huffed. "I was on the stagecoach with her," Mrs. Gable said, ignoring him. She turned to the crowd. "We crashed in the creek. The driver was hurt, bleeding to death. That salesman over there." She pointed to a man in the third row. "He panicked, but she didn't." She pointed at Alara. "She tore her petticoats to bind his wound. She sat up all night in the mud to keep him alive. She behaved with modesty and grace, even when I was unkind to her." Mrs. Gable looked at Alara, her expression softening. "She told me she was afraid," Mrs. Gable said. "She told me a man back east had ruined her life because she wouldn't let him own her. I didn't believe her then. But looking at that man there," she gestured to Thorne, "I believe her now." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not a drifter. This was Mrs. Gable, a pillar of the church. Thorne's smile vanished. He looked at the judge, his eyes hard. "Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a threat. My employer, Mr. Sterling, has significant investments in this territory, railroad investments. He would be very displeased to hear that a local magistrate allowed a fugitive to go free based on the sentimentality of a few yokels. The judge went pale. He looked at the angry townspeople, then at the menacing figure of Thorne. He was caught between money and a riot. "Order!" the judge shouted, banging his gavel. "Order! This court is undecided. The testimony is conflicting. I need time to review the documents." "She comes with me," Thorne demanded. "No," the judge said, finding a shred of backbone. "She stays in custody, protective custody, in the jailhouse, under the sheriff's guard. I will render a decision tomorrow morning." "Your Honor," Silas started. "That is final," the judge yelled. "Sheriff, take them back." Night fell over the jailhouse, heavier and darker than any night in the mountains. The back room was cold. Silas and Alara sat on the bunk, wrapped in the single thin blanket. The sounds of the town had died away, leaving only the pacing of the deputy in the outer office. They held on to each other with a desperation that hurt. Every touch felt like a memory being made for a future they might not have. "He will rule against us," Alara whispered. Thorne scared him. "We will run," Silas whispered back, his lips against her ear. "Tonight, when the deputy sleeps, I can pick the lock. We take the horses and we go north, to Canada. Silas, you can't run forever. Your leg—" "I can run far enough," he said fiercely. He kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and fear. His hands roamed over her back, memorizing the feel of her. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders. They needed to be close. They needed to assert that they belonged to each other. Not to the law, not to the past. The desire that flared between them was sharp, edged with the terror of separation. They kissed until they were breathless, trying to merge into one being that could not be torn apart. Alara pulled back, her forehead resting against his. "Silas," she whispered, "there is something I have to tell you." "Tell me." My bleeding is late," she said. 2 weeks." Silas froze. He pulled back just enough to look at her face in the gloom. "Late?" he breathed. I think we are going to have a child." The words hung in the damp air. Silas stared at her. Emotions crashed over his face like waves. Shock, terror, the realization that the stakes had just risen to the heavens. A child. His child. "A baby," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Yes." Tears welled in his eyes, tears of a joy so sharp it felt like a wound. He placed his large hand gently over her stomach, covering it completely. "A child," he repeated. Then the fear came back, darker than before. If they took her, they took his child. They would raise his child in a prison, or give it away. His face hardened. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal resolve. He looked at the barred door. "They will never take you," Silas said. His voice was different now. It wasn't just a husband speaking. It was a father. "I will burn this town to the ground before I let them take the mother of my child." "Silas, we are not victims. Alara," he said, gripping her face. "We are a family, and tomorrow we fight." By morning, the tension in Pine Hollow was a physical thing, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. News of the hearing had spread. Mrs. Gable had talked. The miners had talked. The story of the mountain man defending his wife, of the rich man's hired gun threatening the town, had struck a nerve. The town was split. Some, led by the nervous shopkeepers, wanted Alara gone to avoid trouble with the East. But others, the women who knew what it was to be judged, the men who resented the Eastern money pushing them around, were growing angry. A crowd began to gather outside the jailhouse before dawn. They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. Inside. Silas stood by the window, watching the sun come up over the peaks he loved. Alara sat on the bunk, her hands over her stomach. "It is time," Silas said. He turned to her. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a king in buckskins. "Ready?" he asked. Alara stood up. She smoothed her dress. She thought of the life growing inside her. She thought of the scissors and the snow. "Ready?" she said. The key turned in the lock. The air in the meeting hall was stagnant, thick with the smell of damp wool and nervous sweat. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the high windows, illuminating the weary face of Judge Blackmore. He sat behind the heavy oak table, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away the headache that this case and the man standing before him had caused. Elias Thorne stood near the front bench, his posture rigid with impatience. He checked his pocket watch, snapping the gold lid shut with a click that echoed in the silence. "Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice tight. "We have indulged this theater long enough. The woman is a fugitive. The warrant is valid. My employer, Mr. Sterling, is a man of significant influence in Washington. He will not look kindly on a territorial magistrate who allows a thief to hide behind a wedding ring." The judge hesitated. He looked at the papers spread before him, then at the crowded room. He saw the grim faces of the miners, the folded arms of the women who had listened to Alara's testimony. He looked at Silas Blackwood, who stood like a granite statue beside his wife, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "The testimony is troubling," Judge Blackmore said slowly. "If what Mrs. Blackwood says is true, the warrant is built on perjury." "It is the word of a whore against a gentleman," Thorne snapped, losing his smooth veneer. "Watch your tongue," Silas rumbled. The sound was low, but it carried a vibration that made the wood of the benches hum. "I am done waiting," Thorne declared. He turned his back on the judge. He looked at Deputy Miller, who was standing by the door, looking pale and indecisive. "Miller, take her into custody, now, or I will wire the marshal and have your badge." Miller shifted his feet, looking at Sheriff Brady. The sheriff did not nod. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his eyes narrowed. "I said take her!" Thorne shouted. When no one moved, Thorne lunged. It happened in a blur. Thorne crossed the 3 feet of space separating him from the couple. He reached for Alara, his hand closing around her upper arm, his fingers digging into the flesh. "You are coming with me," Thorne hissed. Alara cried out, stumbling as he yanked her. Silas moved faster than a man with a bad leg should have been able to. He didn't reach for a weapon. He used his body. He slammed into Thorne, his shoulder hitting the smaller man's chest with the force of a battering ram. "Get your hands off her," Silas roared. He shoved Thorne backward. Thorne stumbled, crashing into a bench, his hat flying off. The room erupted. Men shouted, women screamed, and people scrambled to get out of the way. Thorne scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a mask of humiliation and rage. He reached under his duster. "No!" Sheriff Brady shouted, drawing his own weapon. But Thorne was faster. He pulled a nickel-plated revolver from a shoulder holster. He didn't aim at Silas. He aimed wildly, desperate to regain control through fear. Silas saw the glint of metal. He didn't think. He grabbed Alara and spun her, shoving her behind his broad back, covering her body with his own. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. A woman in the front row shrieked. High above, the glass of a window shattered, raining shards down onto the floorboards like jagged diamonds. Silence slammed back into the room, ringing in everyone's ears. Thorne stood panting, the gun smoking in his hand. He looked wild, his eyes darting around the room. He realized too late what he had done. He had not established authority. He had crossed a line that even the rough law of the frontier held sacred. He had drawn a weapon in a court of law. He had fired into a crowd. Silas straightened up slowly. He checked Alara. She was pale, clutching his coat, but unharmed. Silas turned to look at Thorne. He didn't charge. He didn't have to. Sheriff Brady walked forward. His face was set in a hard, dangerous line. He didn't look like a tired bureaucrat anymore. He looked like the man who had kept the peace in a mining camp for 20 years. "Drop it," Brady said. Thorne hesitated. "Sheriff, I said drop it," Brady shouted, cocking the hammer of his Colt. "Or so help me God. I will drop you." Thorne's hand shook. The gun clattered to the floor. "You are under arrest," Brady said, his voice flat. He holstered his gun and pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. He spun Thorn around, slamming him face first against the wall. Reckless endangerment, attempted assault, contempt of court, and discharging a firearm in a public building. You can't do this, Thorn sputtered as the cuffs clicked shut. I work for Sterling. Do you know who I am? I know exactly who you are, Brady said, marching him toward the door. You are the man who just tried to shoot a woman in my town. The sheriff looked at the judge. Your Honor, you have a ruling? Judge Blackmore looked at the shattered window. He looked at the hired gun being dragged away. The veneer of Eastern respectability had cracked, revealing the ugly violence underneath. He looked at Silas and Alara, standing together in the center of the storm. He picked up his gavel. The court finds, Judge Blackmore said, his voice shaking slightly, that the warrant presented by Mr. Thorn is suspect, likely obtained through coercion and false testimony. Furthermore, this court has no obligation to enforce the private grievances of men who send armed thugs to do their bidding. He slammed the gavel down. Case dismissed. The prisoner is released. Mrs. Blackwood is free to go. The words hung in the air for a second, disbelieving and sweet. Alara let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Her legs gave way. Silas caught her, his arm a steel band around her waist. Did you hear? Silas whispered into her hair. Alara, it is done. They turned to leave. The aisle was crowded, but this time, no one shrank away. No one whispered. Henderson, the storekeeper who had refused them credit, took a step back. Pulling his hat from his head, he nodded, his eyes lowered in shame. Mrs. Gable stood by the door, her hands clasped, tears in her eyes. She reached out as Alara passed and squeezed her hand. Go home, Mrs., Gable whispered. Go home to your mountain. They walked out into the blinding spring sunshine. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and melting snow. Alara stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at the sheriff leading Thorn to the jailhouse. She looked at the mountains rising purple and white in the distance. The fear that had lived in her chest for 3 years, the tight, coiling snake of dread, uncoiled and vanished. She buried her face in Silas's chest and wept. They were not tears of sadness. They were the tears of a soldier who had just been told the war was over. Silas held her. He didn't care who was watching. He rested his chin on the top of her head. His eyes closed, his arms crushing her against him. He felt the trembling of her body, and he felt the answering tremor in his own heart. You are safe, he murmured. No one's property, just mine, and I am yours. The ride back to the cabin felt like a dream. The horses sensed the change in their riders. They stepped lightly, ears pricked forward. The valley had changed. On the ride down, the cliffs had looked like prison walls, trapping them. Now, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, golden shadows across the trail, the mountains looked like fortress battlements. They were strong, they were ancient, they were protectors. They reached the clearing at twilight. The cabin sat snug against the rock, the chimney dark. Silas helped Alara down. They didn't go inside immediately. They stood by the gate of the garden fence Silas had repaired, looking at the small world they had carved out of the wilderness. The roof was patched and solid. The woodpile was stacked high, a monument to their labor. The smoke hatch was open, waiting for a fire. Home, Alara whispered. Silas stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. It is small. It is rough. It is a palace, she said. She turned in his arms, looking up at him. Silas, the baby. What if they come back? What if the winter is too hard? The fear was natural, a mother's fear. Silas looked out over the valley. He saw the river glinting like a silver thread in the darkness. He saw the tracks of mule deer near the tree line. He saw the first wildflowers, pasque flowers and shooting stars, pushing up through the rocky, unforgiving soil. Look at this place, Silas said softly. It is hard. It does not forgive mistakes. It kills the weak. He looked back at her, his eyes fierce. But it is honest. It does not lie. It does not smile at you while it holds a knife behind its back. If you work, you eat. If you build, you have shelter. He placed his hand over her stomach. We will raise the child here, he said. We will teach him to read the snow and listen to the wind. We will teach her to shoot and to mend. And we will teach them that they belong here, not because someone owns them, but because they belong to themselves. Alara covered his hand with hers. Belong to themselves, she repeated. Yes. Spring turned into summer, and the high country exploded with life. The meadows became oceans of bluebells and paintbrush. The elk moved up to the high pastures, their calves stumbling behind them on spindly legs. Life in the cabin deepened. The frantic edge of survival softened into a rhythm of domestic peace. Silas no longer slept with one eye open. He slept deeply, his arm thrown over his wife, waking only when the sun hit the pillow. They developed rituals, small and sacred. Every morning, Silas would rise first and start the coffee. He would bring a cup to Alara, sitting on the edge of the bed as she woke, watching the light play on her face. He would rest his hand on her belly, which was swelling now, rounding with the life inside. He kicked, Silas said one morning, a look of wonder on his scarred face. She, Alara corrected, smiling sleepily. She is restless today. She has your temper, Silas grinned. In the evenings, Alara would sit by the fire mending, while Silas whittled or cleaned his tools. Often, he would drift off in the chair, his head tipping back. Alara would put down her needle and go to him, smoothing the hair back from his forehead, her fingers tracing the white line of the scar that ran into his beard. He would wake, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. The desire between them changed. It was no longer the desperate, storm-driven hunger of two people afraid they would die before morning. It became a steady, burning fire, warm, constant, and deep. They made love with a slow, deliberate tenderness, mindful of the child, mindful of each other. Every touch was a reaffirmation of the choice they had made. It was safe. It was rooted in a trust so absolute it felt like bedrock. They went to town occasionally. They did not hide. Some people still stared. Mrs. Higgins still crossed the street to avoid them. But others stopped to talk. Henderson gave them a fair price for the spring furs, adding a bag of sugar to the order without charge. For the little one, Henderson mumbled, not meeting Silas's eyes. One afternoon, as Alara was looking at bolts of flannel, the town midwife, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Miller, no relation to the deputy, sidled up to her. You're carrying low. Mrs. Miller said quietly. Drink raspberry leaf tea. It strengthens the womb. And when the time comes, send Silas down. I'll come. Doesn't matter what the preacher says. Alara squeezed the woman's hand, gratitude choking her. Thank you. News traveled slowly to the territories, but it traveled in late August. A letter arrived for the sheriff, but the contents leaked to the general store. Mr. Sterling, the great man of Boston, had fallen. It wasn't the law that got him. It was society. Rumors of his brutality had spread. Other women had come forward. His investors had pulled out. Fearing the scandal, he had lost his shop, his reputation, and his influence. He was a ruined man, bankrupt and alone. Silas brought the news to the cabin. Alara listened, sitting on the porch as she shelled peas. She didn't cheer, she didn't laugh. She just looked at the mountains, feeling a strange, quiet satisfaction settling in her chest. It wasn't revenge. Revenge was hot and bitter. This was justice. It was the feeling of the scales finally balancing. He can't hurt us, she said. He never could, Silas said. Not really. The seasons turned. The aspen gold flared and fell. The first frost crunched underfoot. Hardship still found them. A late frost killed the last of the garden tomatoes. A forest fire in the next valley choked the air with smoke for a week, keeping them on edge, bags packed, ready to run to the river. A bout of mountain fever laid Silas low for 3 days, leaving Alara to chop the wood and haul the water, her heavy body making the work agonizing. But they endured. They were tempered steel now. November came, bringing the dark clouds and the biting wind. The labor started at midnight, carried on the back of a storm. Ilara woke with a gasp, a pain wrapping around her lower back like a tightening vice. She grabbed Silas's arm. "It is time," she whispered. Silas was up instantly. He built the fire up until it roared. He set water to boil. He paced the small room, his face pale with a terror he had never felt in battle. "I have to go for the midwife," he said, looking at the window where rain lashed against the glass. "No!" Ilara cried, another contraction seizing her. "The trail! The mud! You won't make it back in time. Stay! Please! Silas! Stay!" He stayed. The night was an eternity. The storm howled outside, mimicking the storm inside the cabin. The birth was hard. It was violent and bloody, echoing the pain of Ilara's past. There were moments when the fear overtook her, when the pain felt like a punishment, like a trap she couldn't escape. She screamed, thrashing on the bed, begging for it to stop. Silas was her anchor. He held her hands. He wiped her face with cool cloths. He didn't flinch away from the blood or the screams. "Look at me," he commanded when she started to panic. "Ilara, look at me." She focused on his dark eyes. "You have survived worse than this," he told her, his voice fierce and low. "You survived the city. You survived the snow. You survived the lies. You can do this. You are the strongest woman God ever made." "I can't," she sobbed. "You can," he said. "Push. For us. Push." She drew on a strength she didn't know she had. She drew on the anger at Sterling, the love for Silas, the sheer, stubborn will to live that had brought her west. And then, just as the dawn began to turn the gray sky to pearl, a cry filled the room. It was a thin, angry wail that cut through the sound of the rain. Silas caught the child. His hands, usually so large and clumsy, were incredibly gentle. He wrapped the slick, squalling bundle in a clean towel. "Ilara," he choked out. "Ilara, look." He laid the baby on her chest. Ilara was exhausted, her hair plastered to her skull, her body trembling. She looked down. It was a boy. He had a tuft of dark hair and a face that was red and wrinkled and furious. He opened his eyes, dark, like his father's, and stared at her. The love hit her like a physical blow. It was overwhelming. It made her chest ache. It washed away the pain, the fear, the memory of every bad thing that had ever happened to her. "He is perfect," she whispered. Silas knelt by the bed. He put his arms around both of them, burying his face in the mattress. His shoulders shook. The walls he had built around his heart for 20 years, the walls of solitude, of believing love was a weakness, crumbled into dust. "Thank you," he wept. "Thank you." The storm broke an hour later. The clouds lifted, revealing the peaks of the Sawtooth Ridge washed clean, glittering under a new, brilliant sun. The air was cold and sweet. Silas opened the door. He helped Ilara stand, wrapping a heavy quilt around her and the child. They stepped out onto the porch. The world was silent. The only sound was the drip of water from the pines and the soft breathing of the baby asleep against Ilara's chest. Silas stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her and his son. He rested his chin on her hair. They looked out at the valley. It was still wild. There were still bears in the timber and ice in the shadows. The town was still down there, with its petty judgments and its laws. But none of it mattered. They had turned a desperate bargain into a life. They had taken 2 broken histories and forged a future. "What do we call him?" Silas asked softly. Ilara looked at the baby's strong hand, curling around Silas's finger. "Thomas," she said. "For your brother." Silas went still. He tightened his hold on her. "Thomas," he agreed, his voice thick. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun climb over the mountains, bathing their home in light. They knew the West would always be harsh. They knew the world would always be imperfect. But as they stood together, breathing the same air, they knew that their love had survived war, shame, lies, and the cold indifference of others. Together, they had found the only thing that mattered. They had found peace. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Silas and Alara, from the frozen isolation of the mountains to the warmth of a life built on trust and courage. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the American frontier, where the landscapes are vast, the lives are hard, and the love is always worth the fight. Please share your thoughts on the ending in English. Did Silas and Alara find the justice they deserved? Until next time, keep your powder dry and your fires bright.